So this sounds good when presented encapsulated, but I think in this day and age, just a word being in a university environment, I think there's a lot of pressure on people to feel like they have to have a very clear path from A to B to C in their life, and it can feel extremely anxiety generating to have dropouts in that space. And let me just tell you that this CV that you just heard encapsulated, there's a bunch of very big rifts in it, like tears in the fabric that got sewn with, kind of with very heavy duty thread. And that's, one of them was bailing out of journalism. I had this great job as an NPR correspondent, right? And I show up, I cover the fall of the Taliban, and I just felt compelled to shut up already and do something about it. And so I bailed with no real sense of what it was that I was going to do. And so just to say, try to leave yourselves open the degree that you can, those of you who are in earlier portions of your career, to letting the world have a vote, because it can produce as often as you might, and I really felt like, God, am I a loser? I just bailed on this great NPR, like what did I ever want to be when I grew up except an NPR correspondent? And I bail on this with no real sense of what I was doing, but it led to a really fascinating decade that went from very, very grassroots involvement in Afghanistan to where I'm a direct report to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And when I couldn't take the Pentagon because that environment was too hostile, I'd say, boss, I'm going downrange. And he would basically say, be safe. And then a couple of days later, I'd be driving my little taxi around downtown Kandahar. So it was a very interestingly vertically integrated life that, was on a dirt floor in Kandahar to the, D or E ring of the Pentagon. But what I want to talk about here is kind of the analysis that's emerged from this experience and a lot of thinking about it since. And it's about corruption, a word that has come back into style in this election season, which I have to say I'm pretty pleased about, because I spent a lot of years trying to flog this word and had a very hard time getting any traction with this word. And yet here it is, kind of getting closer to the center of at least our national debate. But I think there's still a really interesting disconnect on foreign policy. So you're hearing corruption being used as a word in our national political debate. What you don't hear is the relevance of this word to U.S. foreign policy, or to a lot of the crises overseas that U.S. foreign and security policy is trying to interact with. And so let's just take a look at those. And I suspect that if I reel off the following 5 headline topics, it's probably going to engage. What I'd like to see is I'm going to touch on 5 headline topics. Raise your hand if your central area of focus is not included in one of them. Syria, the expansion of ISIS, so Syrian civil war in general. No, not, if it doesn't touch. Wait a second. Expansion of ISIS, mass migration fluxes either into Europe or into North America, Ukraine, Russia, and Boko Haram, kind of Sahel, West Africa, that area. Anyone whose interest area I've missed? What is it?
American extremism.
Okay. Okay, is it American extremism like foreign fighters, or American extremism in America?
In America.
Okay, that doesn't count. It's not a foreign policy crisis, so you don't count. What I'm going to argue is that a very thick strand linking these apparently really disparate crises, right? What does Boko Haram and East-West Cold War conflict in Ukraine have to, standoff in Ukraine have to do with each other? I'm going to argue that corruption is weaving through all of these. And why it does, I think, has to do with 3 elements of the way corruption is kind of being experienced in the world today. Obviously, this is a phenomenon that is as old as human government. But I actually think we're in a slightly, I think it kind of ebbs and flows in how it looks and the degree to which it's actually structuring our societies. And I think we're in a flow. I think we're in a high point, and have been since about, I would say, the end of the 1980s. And there are three elements. One is money. The sheer amount of money that we're talking about is absolutely gigantic. So a friend of mine was for a long time the sole FBI investigator attached to what's now called the Kleptocracy Initiative in the US Department of Justice, which goes after crimes of major corruption committed, of course, by non-American officials. She was, and what she said to me is, God, for the longest time, we had a single billion-dollar case that we were pursuing. This was for years. We had only had $1 billion case. Now we have $5 billion cases open. Does nobody steal less than $1 billion anymore? I mean, it's like really, and some of that is due to increased attention to the problem. It's one of these typical law enforcement issues that are you actually getting more instances of the crime or are you getting more focus on the crime? But still. Secondly, Afghanistan, not a very rich place, as we all know. Two different bribery surveys looking at Afghanistan, meaning the, quote, petty shakedowns, cops, doctors. I know a guy whose father was an American citizen, was blown up in a suicide bombing. He's an Afghan origin American citizen. And his son had gone to pick up the body. He had to pay a bribe to get the death certificate, right? I mean, it's to that level. And I think in a lot of, the countries you guys are interested in, there's that kind of thing. Anyhow, that bribery, petty bribery in Afghanistan is estimated at between $2 and $5 billion a year. That's a country whose licit government revenue is about $1.7 billion a year. So you're talking relatively, and the GDP is about 10. You're talking really significant amounts of money relative to GDP. Another example is Nigeria. So does anyone remember the story of the Chibok girls, the girls who were, so can I have a sense? Everybody? Anybody not know what I'm talking about? The girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram? No one doesn't know. Does anybody know the story about the central bank governor who got fired that year? You do? 1, 2, 3. Anybody else? Hands up. 4, 5. So a little more than 10%. He got fired because he pinpointed a shortfall in the oil revenues. And when he really did the numbers, it comes out to approximately $20 billion over a 19-month period. That's $1 billion a month in national revenue that was going missing. And the reason I compared it to Chibok is when you think about the damage done to the society of Nigeria between losing $1 billion a month and the kidnapping. I'm not trying to obviously excuse the kidnapping of 257 young women. I'm just saying the level of international attention that that got compared to the level of international attention that $1 billion a month got is pretty remarkable, especially because the instinctive reaction when the Chibok, that guy was fired in February, and incidentally, he had been voted Central Banker of the Year a couple of years ago. I mean, how he handled the whole 2008, 2009 financial crisis was a lesson that I wish our financial system governors had heeded. He actually put some bankers in jail. So there was this upsurge of we need to help the government of Nigeria, find the Chibok girls. But no one, part of that was not, and oh, by the way, we also need to tell Goodluck Jonathan that it's not okay to steal $1 billion a month. So anyway, that's amount of money. And you can just think through what the development and economic implications of those amounts of money are. The second piece that's really important is structure. So even when people want to make a big deal out of corruption, often the metaphors they use are things like cancer, corrosion, epidemic. They're very ugly words, right? I mean, cancer is a terrifying phenomenon. However, those words tend to give you the, I don't know, implicit idea that you've got a body, right, that's somehow being attacked by this corruption thing, that corruption is corroding, it's eating away at this body, or you have a weak body, and in its weakness, corruption can somehow seep in. And I would like to suggest a different, pretty provocative way of understanding it, which is we're not looking at fragile or failing governments so much as we're looking at very sophisticated and successful criminal organizations that are masquerading as governments. And so if you start thinking about it that way, and it's, as I say, quite a provocative way to think about it, but there's some implications for how you analyze such a structure. So the first one is criminal organizations are usually integrated. They're integrated vertically, meaning, for example, in a mafia, the little street level, lookouts and stuff like that, they're part of the team. And when they get in trouble, they are usually protected, right? I mean, the street level guys, if they get arrested, then you get a really good lawyer. The mafia provides you a really good lawyer. That's part of the deal in return for the money that's going upwards into the system, right? So when you're doing drug deals or whatever it might be for a criminal organization, you have to pay the proceeds up, and you get something in return for that. You get a part of the proceeds for yourself, and you get protection. So that's exactly how it worked in Afghanistan, where we had, so let me just do this sort of center, and then you had like a governor, a provincial chief of police, whatever you have here, and then you've got the little peeps down there. And where a patronage system, money flows or benefits are going downwards in a patronage system. In this system, the money is going upwards because the people are being extorted for that $2 to $5 billion a year. And then the governor is, or the street level cop, right, down here, is taking that money, but he's paying part of the money upwards to his precinct captain or his, whatever, or he has purchased his position in the police. No matter how lousy the salary is, he's actually buying his position. And then the money goes upwards to the minister or whatever. And in return, what was provided in Afghanistan was permission to extract resources however you want, and protection. And so that's vertical integration. Horizontal integration, and it can take different forms, the vertical integration, but you get the basic idea. Horizontal integration, especially we Americans, and especially in a election year, love to make a big distinction between the government, the public sector, and the private sector, right? And we get into lots of arguments about which is more detrimental to, happiness in America, the public sector or the private sector. But fundamentally, we see them as separate entities. And then those are good guys. And then the bad guys are even further over here, and they're criminals and they're terrorists, right? So what's interesting is that I would go into a brigade or a battalion level tactical operations center in Ghazni or something like that, and I'd get an intel ops brief, and I would get a beautiful spiderweb chart on this. I would get, with photographs where we had them, the Taliban commander of 20 guys, and the pictures of his guys, and the telephone, and all that stuff. And I'd say, great, beautiful piece of work. Now give me the spiderweb chart on the district chief. That side, nothing. They would not have developed it. Now, law enforcement in the US does great network analysis of criminal organizations. What I'm suggesting is that a lot of these governments are integrated across all four of these sectors. So you will have in a government, or let's say in a province or a state in Nigeria, you've got the governor, and his brother-in-law is the head of the biggest, construction company in the state. So when he gets his share of the oil revenues, then he decides to build a gigantic infrastructure project. and his brother just happens to win that contract. And then there's inflated, bills of whatever. I mean, the whole budget is inflated. And the brother-in-law gets his own share, and, the governor and the permanent secretary and kind of three levels into the bureaucracy get their share. And so that's private sector. That's these two that are integrated. Very often, again, I spent 10 years in Kandahar, so Ahmed Wali Karzai was President Karzai's brother. Now, he didn't actually grow opium, but he certainly was deeply engaged in the criminal industry because he could make sure that the trafficking routes were clear of any problems, because he would appoint the district chiefs of police and the district governors along the trafficking routes so that he could pick up the phone when one of his convoys was making its way out. So there was deep integration, and Gulagh Shirzai, who was the governor of Kandahar and went on to be the governor in the eastern part of the country in Nangarhar province, he was deeply involved in this. I mean, he was, And then it's really helpful to have informal instruments of force, if you will, at your disposal. So that may take the form of terrorists where they exist. It may take the form of thugs in a place like Egypt or, some other places. So, here I am, Sarah Chayes, American gal living in downtown Kandahar, no sandbags, no barbed wire. If I had been killed in Kandahar in 2009, who would have ever wondered, but it was the Taliban who had killed this, barefaced American female running around wearing a turban, right? Like, nobody would have given that a second thought. And the fact that the Taliban had gotten a call from Ahmed Wali Karzai, I mean, unless he had done that on a phone that somebody was tapping, which he would never have done because he was too smart, who would ever, right? I mean, in an environment like that, it's really helpful. And I remember a friend of mine coming down from a district north of Kandahar, and this was after the 2009 surge, and he knew the Taliban commanders in his district. So he would say, by name, you got this guy went to Pakistan, you captured this one, and you killed this one. And these were all actual Taliban commanders. So it's just that they were all from one tribe. And then when he went down the names of the Taliban commanders from the Karzai's tribe, we hadn't touched a single one of them. So it's just sort of interesting how that works out. So that's horizontal integration. Then another really critical aspect of structure is that this structure controls a government, which means there are all sorts of other instruments, levers in their hands that they can bend to their purposes. So they have an informal instrument of force, but they can also bend the formal instruments of force to their purposes. So the Amana Shurta in Mubarak's Egypt, that was a particular police element that was the kind of attack dogs of the Mubarak network. That was their enforcement arm. In Cameroon, it's the Rapid Intervention Brigade. It's an army brigade. I've found it's more frequent that it's either police or internal security than that it's a military element, but sometimes it's a military element. But then you also have the civilian elements of state functions. So one of the most diabolical ones I discovered was, or kind of like a fevered imagination, in Tunisia. One of the really lucrative export items, Tunisia does not have mineral resources. It's got beautiful dates. So I went down to the date oases in southern Tunisia, and what I discovered there was that public infrastructure, obviously the constraint on growing dates is water, right? And there is now public infrastructure in those oases. So there are pipes that channel water. There's some proper seats and nobody minds. Come on ahead and join us. Not at all, not at all. And Sakhr al-Matri was the son-in-law of Mubarak. And basically, they would go and tell me, here's what I'm going to buy your dates for. the very beautiful décolleté noir dates, the ones that get exported to the Gulf. And if I complained about the price they were offering, basically I wouldn't have any water the next day because it was the Department of Agriculture that controlled the water flow. So that's a way that you can get the civilian infrastructure to be a kind of, civilian elements of state function, to be part of your enforcement mechanism for extracting money. The tax authority in Uzbekistan, similarly, I had a guy say, look, there are so many different tax laws that you literally cannot obey them all. So they force you to break the law, and then so you find someone in the tax authority that you can talk to get your, to get your file through, but then they have you on a hook. And as soon they've broken the law, they know, one of these things. And literally, he says, then they have a hook. And when they want to, they can yank you out of the water. And so the implications for analysis are that on a country-specific basis, you really want to dissect what are the elements of state function specifically that in this particular country are most instrumental to the kleptocratic network for getting their business done, which is maximizing revenues to themselves. So that's structure. I haven't yet obviously gotten to extremism. We're getting there. But part of the point of this is, as you can imagine, so what you can sort of do is divide this up into what are the key, so it could be the ag ministry. In a couple of countries I've been looking at, the education ministry is really central because it's indoctrinating people into a certain kind of national. Azerbaijan, I think, is one of them we've looked at. Ethiopia. You can just look at what are the key sort of ministries, the Bureau of Land Management often. But another one that is almost always one of them is justice. So part of the point of when you get a government wired up this way by a kleptocratic network is there is no recourse. And that eventually, people without any means of recourse start getting very irritated. But the last piece of this, and this I think is true always of corruption, but again, I think Westerners tend to underestimate it. I flew here last night from the District of Columbia, quite apart from what's happening in national politics. On a local level, we residents of the District of Columbia are somewhat familiar with corruption. But we experience it as a kind of opportunity cost. I ride a bicycle to work, and we don't have nice green painted bike lanes like you guys do here. And the degree to which corruption causes the roads to be poorly paved is something you really experience with a vengeance when you're riding a bicycle. That's the way I experience corruption in DC. What I don't experience is the personal interaction when somebody is shaking you down for money. And let me just tell you, they don't do it politely. It's not personally a pleasant experience. And so there's a level of humiliation. I think you guys might remember the Arab Spring was often they were called dignity revolutions, right? And so part of that had to do with how people are being treated when they're being shaken down. I start this book, Thieves of State, with an anecdote from our little cooperative where one of my guys had been a police officer. And his brother had a little auto parts store, and he was coming in from the border where he had bought auto parts, and he had actually paid his customs, which is kind of remarkable. And then he's getting shaken down repeatedly, in an hour-and-a-half drive into Kandahar. And when he gets to Kandahar, he gets shaken down again, and he had had it, I've had it with you people, and I've paid about 6 times along the way, so enough already. And he calls his brother, who works for me, because also we kind of know police chiefs and stuff like that. So he's reporting it to us. And before he called us, he said, I've had it, I'm not paying you. And the cop smacks him in the face. Okay, this is a young Afghan man who just got hit in the face by the member of government that is supposed to be defending and protecting him. So he calls us, and it escalates from there. But what my cooperative members said was, by God, he's a former cop. by God, next time I see somebody planting an IED and I see a police vehicle driving along that road, I am not going to raise the alarm. Now, is that literally true? Maybe not. But here's a guy telling an American, I'm going to collude with the Taliban, right? I mean, that's pretty serious. And when I was having this discussion in Nigeria with some justice sector professionals, so there were a couple of things they said. One was, in northern Nigeria, there had been a Sharia movement in around 2000. And there is now Sharia law. There's a separate court system for Sharia law. And what these guys told me, and one of them is a major kind of implementing partner for UK development assistance, and the other was, at the time, the chairman of the Bar Association. So they are sitting there in suits. These are not, Boko Haram fanatic kind of guys. They had said, we expected the Sharia system, we expected the thieves would get their hands cut off. Now, they were using that terminology kind of metaphorically. What they meant was the thieves in Abuja. They meant the big thieves, the $1 billion a month kind of thieves. We were expecting the thieves to get their hands cut off. And next morning we woke up and the thieves still had their two hands. And so faced with that situation, some people will say there's no reforming this system. You can only overturn it and kind of revolutionize it. So that's one piece of it. But the second piece of it is, in another conversation I had, we were just talking about literally the mechanics of corruption in the justice sector. And a prosecutor interrupts the conversation and says, Sarah, you've just been talking about money so far. But it's not just money. And he tells me the story about the lady who wants to spring her husband from jail on bail. She said, I promise I will deliver him for trial, but he's diabetic. And the guy's going to die, which he did in the end, if I don't get his medicine to him. The judge took advantage of her. This is called sextortion, and I'm really shocked that as a female, I hadn't been thinking about this all the way along. But I came like screeching to a halt when I heard that. And then the next thing I thought was her brother. What does her brother want to do? He wants to shoot the judge, right? And guess what? There's an insurgent movement that wants nothing more than for him to shoot the judge. So if you take my cooperative member, in 2009 in Kandahar, you had to work pretty hard as a 27-year-old male not to join the Taliban. So when the police are daily giving you a pretext to join the Taliban, it doesn't take much for you to cross that line. And same thing, in a place like Nigeria. It's a little different because Boko Haram has just been so off the charts violent in the last couple of years. But back in 2009, 10, 11, that would have been a really tempting thing for somebody to do. And the reason is, so I finally made it to Maiduguri, this last trip to Nigeria, which is the sort of birthplace of Boko Haram. And I spent a day hanging out with people in neighborhoods. And I kind of asked, so what were they saying when they started preaching? And literally the argument was, and this is also for some of the law folks in the room, it was a specific constitutional argument. The argument was the reason the judge behaves in such a depraved way, the broadest sense of the term corruption, is because he doesn't obey God. And if only we had a government that was organized according to God's law, then there's no way they could behave that way. Well, sorry, he used constitutional. He said it's because of the secular constitution of Nigeria. Now that's cheating because in fact the judge is violating the Nigerian constitution. But the argument was, and again, if you're a regular citizen and you see the pervasity of this type of behavior, and then the preacher comes in and says, the reason you're seeing this in every single government official that you encounter is because that's part of our Constitution. Well, you're not going to go back and read the Constitution. It's a very persuasive argument. And so that's really the argument that's being made. And I'd just like to pause and say this association is not unique to Islam in the 21st century. And so that's another thing I do with Thieves of State, is take you on a kind of historical jaunt. So God bless the bookstore, kind of person who has to decide which shelf this book goes on, because there's a couple of chapters of history. And what I was thinking through, so let me just go to John Locke, right? Anybody read John Locke? A couple of you, yeah. I mean, we've all heard of him, right? I hadn't read him until I started doing this research. He was a 17th century political theorist on whose work a lot of our own Constitution is based. And so he said, where there is a barefaced wresting of the law to basically serve the purposes of a man or a party of men, war is made on the sufferers. Extremely strong language. He actually puts this passage occurs in State of War in, I think, the second discourse on government, if I remember correctly. So war is made on the sufferers who, lacking an appeal on earth to right them, are left to the only remedy in such cases, an appeal to heaven. He's basically predicting violent, religiously based extremism. I read that, I was reading in bed at night, and I think I let out a yell, because that had been exactly my kind of hypothesis, and here this guy in the 17th century spells it out for me, you know. So I thought about that, and, you know, John Locke was what? He was a Puritan. He was a Puritan, and I grew up in Massachusetts, and we used to have on the Massachusetts Turnpike, we had a picture of the Puritan hat with an arrow through it. That was the emblem of the Massachusetts Turnpike. And that made me think about, what did the Puritans used to wear? They had this kind of uniform, whether they were Huguenots in France or Dutch Puritans or English Puritans or the folks in Plymouth. They had this ostentatiously conservative black uniform that looks a lot like the uniform that Salafis wear, whether they are Afghans or Iraqis or, you know, ISIS, right? And this kind of ostentatious eschewing of fun things to do like drinking and dancing and, you know, stuff like that. And as I look deeper into it, I mean, it's really interesting. The English Civil War, the Dutch Revolt back in the 16th century, which I had never known anything about and read into for the purposes of this book. And what I found, the Dutch Revolt was the kind of most interesting intersection of this revolt against no appeal on earth and militant puritanical religion. This is happening just after the Protestant Reformation. And so that caused me to go back and read Martin Luther. And I would just urge you to do that for 30 seconds, Martin Luther, 95 Theses, and you will find it's all about corruption. It's about simony, it's about indulgences, it's about, you know, the way that you know, church cases, that the way that cases were heard in church courts. It's all of this stuff. And while I'm not saying there wasn't a doctrinal element and a spiritual element in the Protestant Reformation, what I find really interesting is that all the things that Martin Luther changes in Christian doctrine were all places where the Catholic Church had a toll booth and was collecting on the people. And so then you look at, and what happens in the Dutch Revolt is an intersection between a political revolt and a religious, violent religious extremism, because they also do iconoclasm, this thing where they go on this tear in 1566 and they attack the buildings. And I had always thought they just kind of attacked the statue, like the faces of the statues, because it was idolatrous to show the human figure. But in fact, they went after every single manifestation of this extorted wealth. They tore up the linens, and they melted down the plate, and they smeared the butter all over the walls, and they actually sometimes even threw the statues out of windows. They defenestrated or cut the statues' heads off as though it were a judicial sentence. I'm not trying to draw this parallel too exactly, but it really reminded me a little bit about flying airplanes into buildings. You know, where you've got a building that somehow represents this extorted wealth that you are upset about. So that's kind of how I get from corruption to religious extremism. And I'm not trying to excuse the way that violence manifests itself today. I'm just saying that as we keep on hearing about CVE, right, countering violent extremism, I'm hearing a lot of talk about ideology. I'm hearing a lot of talk about very general economic, like unemployment. Egyptians did not go out into the street in the Arab Spring against unemployment in general. They went out into the street against Gamal Mubarak having privatized public industries directly into the hands of himself and his cronies, and therefore throwing 500,000 Egyptians into the street. There was, in people's minds, a direct relationship between corruption and unemployment. It's not a kind of anonymous structural economic phenomenon. In people's minds, anyway, it's very connected to this corruption. So I think that's where we go. Just to finish up with a couple of thoughts, I'm not saying corruption is the sole cause of all of this stuff, obviously. I'm saying it's a significant and underappreciated driver. I think it's important to think of it as intersecting with other risk factors, such as a deep identity rift, a severe environmental pressure, severe inequality, which I think it can also feed. I think severe corruption feeds severe inequality, but when you have both, it's particularly volatile. A recent sudden drop in GDP. I mean, you can imagine what some of the obvious other risk factors might be. I'm just saying when you combine some of those risk factors with acute corruption, you get a very volatile situation. I think there are significant implications for analysis on the one hand, as I've suggested. Also for so another piece of the analysis, you want to do how is it horizontally integrated? What are the elements of state function that have been captured? You also want to do what are the key revenue streams captured by that specific government? So you'll find that in different countries, it's different revenue streams. They overlap with the major economic wellsprings of the country, but they're not identical to them. So you want to really look at what are the revenue streams that the kleptocratic network has captured. So in Uzbekistan, for example, Gulnora Karimova had a corner on the telecoms market. Every telecoms contract, she got 27%. So there are pay-to-play arrangements like this. Cotton in Uzbekistan is a really big feeder of the kleptocratic network in some kind of interesting ways, like forced labor. So GM has a plant in Uzbekistan. 1/10 of GM workers have to go pick cotton for 2 weeks every year, paid for by GM. So the kleptocratic network gets every single public sector employee, not everyone, but again, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10, and it's kind of rotating, either has to pick cotton or has to pay somebody to do it for them. So that's a whole input that the kleptocratic network gets for free. And it's kind of interesting, my former boss, the chairman of Joint Chiefs, is now on the GM board. So he tried to get, the general counsel to invite me to a board meeting so that I could discuss. They think they've got Uzbekistan handled. They don't think they have a corruption issue in Uzbekistan. Okay. So those are some really interesting, when you start drilling down into it, there's some pretty interesting things you can find out. Bahrain is about the size of Rhode Island, and it's got 5 times the population. No, sorry, it's 1/5 the size of Rhode Island, and it's got the same population as Rhode Island. So land is a really big deal. And one of the things that put 1/3 of the population of Bahrain into the streets in the Arab Spring, 1/3 of the total population of the country, was when they looked at Google Maps, which showed the population on this itty-bitty little island. That huge population is shoved up into 1/3 of the landmass. And they are dredging the seafloor. The government is dredging the seafloor to add land to the edges of the island. But of course, that land, which is prime development, tourist, whatever, property, part of it went to our Fifth Fleet. And part of which, again, why do they hate us, right? They're shoved in this tiny amount of land, and then the USG gets a pretty big chunk of Bahrain's land. Why do they hate us? And they don't, which is remarkable. But, so the rest of it goes to cronies of the ruling family. Meanwhile, the fishing villages are now, they're cut off from the sea. So they're cut off from what their livelihood had been. What's really interesting is, again, I work for a Navy guy. He has been sailing into Bahrain since the mid-1980s until I put him together with a dissident after he retired. He had never spoken to a Shiite in Bahrain, and they are the majority of the population. So implications for mill-to-mill relationship. Do we know what role the military unit that we're partnering with is playing in this picture? Or is the military unit that we're partnering with being deliberately hollowed out? We all watched the militaries of 3 countries, Ukraine, Iraq, and Nigeria, collapse one after the other in 2014 as soon as they came up against basically the smell of gunfire. Why? Because they had been deliberately hollowed out for a couple of reasons. One is to protect the kleptocratic network against potential coups, and the other because military budgets are really great revenue streams. So you want to be doing the analysis. When you do the revenue stream analysis, what role is the defense budget playing in the kleptocratic network's revenue streams? When you have, X tens of thousands of ghost soldiers, that adds up to a lot of money when you're stealing their salaries, right? So it has implications for mill-to-mill. It has big implications for development assistance. We talked this morning about infrastructure grants and loans. That means even the IFIs, the international financial institutions that are giving away these loans to do white elephant projects whose objective is to distribute money among the kleptocratic network, not to do whatever they're allegedly supposed to do. So this is pretty unsettling stuff and raises a lot of questions about the presumptions of usefulness of a lot of the types of relationships that are engaged in overseas. Now, I'm not saying prioritize corruption above every single other imperative. What I am saying is let's get the cost-benefit analysis a little closer to right than we have been so far. So with that, I think that leaves us only 15 minutes for what I suspect are some pretty interesting comments or questions. In the back.
So, I have 2 questions. One is, what are the means of fighting corruption? Is it like eliminating human factors, technologies, data accessibility? And the other thing that you were talking about, and I find very interesting, is like it seems that you're saying if we want fighting corruption is priority, then it seems like if you let the extremists win, they will actually eliminate corruption. No,
that's not the implication. So sorry about that.
I mean, that happened like with Mussolini, that happened with the people in what you were saying. I think they were all kind of extremists. Like I'm pretty sure Catholic Church thought Martin Luther was a...
Totally, that's what I'm saying. I am drawing that parallel.
But they fought corruption. So I'm just saying, is that an implication?
Okay, so on the second one first, the implication is not the case. Basically, sometimes it happens. So the Taliban were definitely less corrupt than the current government. It does sometimes happen. And there are cases of sort of strongman governments that are not corrupt, Rwanda being one, Singapore being another. Relatively not corrupt. Now, Singapore plays a different role. Many of the lesser corrupt countries in the world then become purveyors of corruption services to the more corrupt countries in the world. So Singapore is one of those. But the point is that they use this as an argument. That doesn't mean they are necessarily less corrupt themselves. And a really good case in point in that regard is Iran. I mean, Iran is pillaging, the Iranian kleptocratic network is pillaging the oil revenues of that country, although that was very much the Ayatollah's argument for coming to power after the Shah. So it doesn't apply, it doesn't follow that just because an organization uses something as an argument, that they actually, once they come to power, as we all know, politicians will use a lot of things for arguments and then forget it when they come to power. So the logical progression doesn't hold On the first thing, so in the back of Thieves of State, and there are a couple other documents that you guys might want to look at. So you all have to go out and buy Thieves of State. There are a couple things you all have to do in return for coming here. It's now just about to be out in paperback, so it's not too expensive. So it's Thieves of State. You know, you can get it on Amazon and write a little note saying how great I am and stuff like that. But another thing you have to do, especially so when I say this to guys, when I try to push my soap to guys, they sort of go like this, are you trying to make a statement about me here? You know, gals tend to get this, but sorry. Soap, made in Kandahar. And body lotion and body oil and stuff like that. That's another product I'm pushing. But there is a policy wonk version of this argument, which is basically, I think it's called corruption, and you can get it on the Carnegie Endowment site, which is carnegieendowment.org, and then you'll see experts and click on C for Chayes, and then you click on, and then click on latest analysis. Corruption, the unrecognized threat to international security. That boils it down, and in the appendix, along with at the back of Thieves of State, you see a variety of remedies, and I'm going to get closer to answering your question in a second. The other one on the analysis is called Corruption, the Priority Intelligence Requirements. And those of you who have been in, you know, either the military or the intelligence community will understand what this means. It became clear to me that the US intelligence community was not devoting serious attention to this problem set. And so with some formers, I developed a set of questions. It's a pretty odd policy document. It's got about 3 or 4 paragraphs of text, and then all the rest is just questions. And so it's really the questions that ideally you would want answered. But back to yours. Part of the point that I'm trying to make here is, although there's a certain typology to this phenomenon, it's quite different country to country. So I'm not going to give you a remedy. What the paper and Thieves of State do is provide a variety of tools that are available to different actors, be they different elements of the executive branch, be they, you know, legislatures, be they multilateral organizations, be they aid organizations or NGOs, be they businesses, or be they civil society actors. And I think the point is you need a concerted attack by a variety of these different actors that has to be shaped to what is the structure of this kleptocratic network? What are the key revenue streams, right? What is the calendar of interactions? For example, you know, Dilma Rousseff of Brazil is about to, you know, this is last fall, is going to come to the US for a state visit. Well, at the moment that you have 1 million Brazilians in the streets protesting her involvement in the Petrobras scandal, is that the particular moment that the US should choose to roll out the red carpet for a state visit for Dilma Rousseff? Obviously not. So you want to be tailoring your sort of the way you address this situation to what are the calendar events, what are the vulnerabilities of the network, right? So all of the things that you mentioned might be important elements of a program depending on the country, depending on the strength of civil society, depending on what the aspirations of network members are, depending, I mean, I'm in a constant battle with folks in Washington and elsewhere about the former finance minister of Nigeria, who for some reason has a really great reputation. And so Partners for Transparency Fund, which is connected to Transparency International, they just had their 15th anniversary shindig in Washington, at which she was the featured speaker. And I'm like, okay, I get it. She hasn't been accused of corruption yet, but she was the finance minister when $1 billion a month went walking. How can you possibly elevate her and put her on a pedestal as a champion of anti-corruption when she never opened her mouth about it? You should get the guy who got fired, you know? So even things like stature-enhancing public events like that are part of the incentive structure that is selecting for corruption. So what I'm asking for is a total pipe dream, which is a very coordinated, multifaceted approach to the problem. Sir?
I have a question. Can you please speak about your vision of the perspectives of Ukraine with neighboring Russia, trying to address, this issue?
Ukraine is a really fascinating case because, like where I grew up in this issue, security has, to some extent, come to trump corruption. I mean, in the sense that, oh my God, the urgent, the alligators that are closest to the boat are Russia, right? Or that's an argument that has been made. Fortunately, I do think quite a bit of attention has remained on corruption. I feel, again, that without addressing corruption, you get into the situation where it's just the exchange of one kleptocratic network for another. What I find interesting in Ukraine, and I haven't looked at it very closely, is that you do have a pretty sophisticated civil society, and a number of folks who were in the anti-corruption and in the Maidan protests are, both in government or playing quite a bit of an oversight role outside of government. And you have the IMF, for example, that for once seems to be playing a potentially constructive role in linking its financial support to Ukraine to anti-corruption measures. Now, the IMF makes me a little bit nervous because they have a tendency to link their support to much more macroeconomic, quote, reform, which usually means sort of privatization. And privatization in these contexts often means privatizing into the hands of the kleptocratic network. So I'm not sure I trust the IMF to do this right. But I did have a conversation with their sort of first vice president about these issues and talking about how the IMF might be able to play a role with respect, and I can't remember is it Privat Bank? What is the main bank that's kind of funding the Poroshenko regime? I can't remember the name of the bank, but so there's an issue because it's one of these totally corrupted private sector actors, that bank. And yet there's a tendency to sort of turn a blind eye to it because they're the ones who are like paying for rifles for the Ukrainian army. And my suggestion was, let the IMF be the bad guy here, saying, look, we're wicked sorry, but we have these standards and you have to adhere to the standards, and it takes the pressure off of Poroshenko. So it's not him being the bad guy here with his pal who's bailing him out. Again, I'm saying all this based on very little actual personal knowledge of the environment. So a lot of it's a little bit metaphorical, if you will. But the other thing I think about Ukraine is these networks, I said, horizontally integrated. They're often horizontally integrated across national boundaries. So Cameroon and Nigeria are very integrated, and obviously Russia, Ukraine are very integrated kleptocratic networks. So part of Russia's interest in that place has to do with the health and stability of these integrated kleptocratic networks. That's part of why I think, my hypothesis is, that's part of why there are a variety of reasons why, they did this, but I think that's a piece of it.
In the punishment of virtue, you discussed the Yagistan principle.
Right.
So how, in light of that, do we combat corruption in Afghanistan? Like, what are our options?
Oh, we had a billion options. So Yagistan, and that goes back a while, because that's in the early days, which is sort of the deliberate disintegration, which actually doesn't really have to do with corruption. It has to do with how a society that has alternate forms of social structure deals with the capture of its formal institutions of state power by an outside force. So in that book, which was published in 2006, what I was really looking at was how Afghans tend to fall back on their tribal or ethnic structures when their formal institutions were captured either by the Brits or by the Soviets. Now, how I would apply it to corruption is when a criminal organization, captures the formal institutions, again, people tend to fall back more onto their local tribal and ethnic structures. Now, that then exacerbates the ethnic and tribal divides and make people even more sensitive when you have a situation like you have today where you've got a bicephalous executive branch. You have a president and a CEO of the country that come from different ethnic groups and also different kleptocratic networks. So what you have is neither of them can make an appointment, because the other vetoes the other's appointment. So what you have in Afghanistan today is no government. You've got zero government. Now, what we could have done we owned the country, I hate to say it, but that country was on total life support. And Afghans were telling me, when you feed somebody, they obey you. What is this nonsense of you feeding them and then you're obeying them? That is ridiculous. Afghans just thought the whole sovereignty argument was absolutely ridiculous. So when we had control of all of the levers we had, we could have done anything. At either a provincial level, at a national level. I think that after President Karzai forged a third of his votes in 2009, it was time to blow the whistle and say, done, we're doing an interim government here, and just kind of start over again. And then you do things like ensure that low-level public servants are paid enough. We were floating the budget. So what is the excuse for paying cops not a living wage? Then you raise the wage to something they can live on. They no longer have the excuse to be corrupt, and they are out when they're corrupt. No tolerance. There was so much we could have done. Now we have a lot less leverage, but Ashraf Ghani sure wants that assistance money to continue. And I just think it has to be conditioned in very significant ways. Anybody? One more? Anyone over here? We're out of here, guys. So the last thing to write on the board, if anyone does come up with a question. Just an email to get a hold of me. If you want to play out some of what are the implications of this analysis for whatever part of this world you are most engaged. I don't mean geographic world, I mean kind of this space. Thank you all for coming out on a blustery day.